You have green microbangs and a septum ring, and you're always boiling on the inside. Because you're an Smith and you don't eat enough red meat.
Scratch their heads, wondering what to make of it.
1, lazy. 2, the patriarchy.
I don't need to hear your story because I lived your story.
Throughout this video, I am making the case that more attention needs to be paid towards the physical health and nutrition of anyone and everyone struggling with mental health. However, I do not at all wish to draw attention away from the other factors that affect our mental health. Given the context of this video, I believe it's important to first acknowledge that transgender people and people with gender dysphoria, like other similarly at-risk minorities, face a world and culture that is at best incongruent with their identity and at worst hateful, violent, discriminatory, and bullying towards them. There is plenty of scientific evidence of transgender people being at significantly greater risk of experiencing hate crimes, violence, and discrimination, and for these forms of victimization leading to worse mental health outcomes. I believe this is a serious concern, and our society should continue to strive towards reducing and eliminating such forms of victimization. All this being said, there is an argument which is simply untrue and needs to be dispelled. The argument is that the tragically higher rates of anxiety, depression, self-harm, and suicide amongst people with gender dysphoria can be largely attributed to the forms of victimization just mentioned. This cannot be true for the following reasons. The first reason is that no other group or people that is or has been discriminated against as much or more than people with gender dysphoria has ever had such high rates of anxiety, depression, self-harm, and suicide. No race, no ethnicity, no religious following, no sexual orientation, etc. of the past that has faced far greater discrimination at times than what people with gender dysphoria face today has had these rates of anxiety, depression, self-harm, and suicide. Not Black people living in slavery or under Jim Crow, not Jewish people living throughout the various heights of anti-Semitism, not gay men forced to stay in the closet given the tremendous hate they would receive otherwise. I am not at all trying to minimize the discrimination people face today, but what I'm getting at is that there must be something else in addition to the discrimination, an issue much more influential that is driving these very high rates of anxiety, depression, suicide, and self-harm. My second point is that there has been a drastic rise in rates of anxiety, depression, self-harm, and suicide amongst people with gender dysphoria, particularly amongst youth, despite greatly increased acceptance and widespread decreases in discrimination. Why is it that as acceptance is increasing, suicide and mental health issues are also increasing? It doesn't make much sense to blame it all on discrimination or lack of acceptance. My third point is that there has been a corresponding rise in rates of anxiety, depression, self-harm, and suicide amongst people in general, with or without gender dysphoria, especially amongst youth, which again points towards there being a larger issue at play here, one that needs to be investigated for the sake of everyone suffering with poor mental health. To gain a better understanding on mental health, we're going to dive into how mental health is not just exclusively affected by what goes on in our heads, but how our mental health is also largely reflected by the state of our physical health. I often listen to experts speak on social, psychological, and spiritual factors with regards to many issues people face. I won't try to argue that physical health is more important than social, psychological, or spiritual health, as I honestly don't think you can have anywhere close to a complete picture on the well-being of a human when you separate any one from the others by more than a couple of degrees. However, if we think of each type of health as a door or window from which we can peer into a person or change them from within, I find that physical health is not regarded highly enough as one that has great effect on matters that we more often regard as matters of mental health, such as anxiety or depression. The aim of this section is to allow the viewer to see how mental health is largely a reflection of physical health. The way I see it, our mental health is largely a reflection of our inner physiology, are hormones, neurotransmitters, nutrient supplies, available energy, and the like. I refer to this as our inner world, whereas our outer world pertains more to our relationships, the stresses of life, and the activities we might find ourselves engaged in. People give advice all the time for how we can better our outer world to combat poor mental health, but they rarely do so for how we can better our inner world for the same purpose. Someone might prescribe ways to shift mindset for people suffering from chronic anxiety while completely disregarding the state of the anxious person's inner world. It's like giving band-aids to a diabetic. Sure, they are useful techniques for the moment of a problem, but someone with a chronic illness needs to address root causes. I usually illustrate my point in a couple ways. First, picture a young, happy, healthy child with a good appetite who loves to be social, laugh, and move around. Then they catch a cold. Suddenly, they are miserable, have no appetite, and want to hide under the covers all day. They're basically in the same state as someone with chronic depression. What's going on here? The child obviously didn't just have an attitude shift. They still have the same social support and relationships they'd always had. The thing that is different is that their body's finite supply of energy is being used for other, more critical purposes at that moment. In this case, they are fighting off the infection. During an infection, the innate intelligence of the body shunts energy away from digestion, away from any creative, happy, or humorous thought, and away from movement so it can focus the available energy towards fighting the infection. Immune cells actually have the highest metabolic rate, which is the rate of energy consumption, compared to any cell type in humans. Luckily, when we are healthy, immune cells don't need to be very active. If you've ever had an infection, you may have even noticed that your hair doesn't feel and look as healthy as it usually is. This is because non-essential physiological processes, such as hair growth, use up energy and nutrition, and your body is channeling that energy and nutrition towards fighting the infection instead. The same goes for libido and reproductive functioning. This exact pattern of reduction in mood, reduction in cognition, movement, appetite, tissue growth, and repair, libido, is going on in cases of chronic depression. It seems obvious that a systemic lack of energy is at the root of what we call depression. Neurons have an incredibly high metabolic rate. Though only 2% of your body mass, your brain uses up about 20 to 25% of your blood, oxygen, and energy supply. It actually takes a lot of energy to think of funny jokes. Think of people who you know who are constantly cracking jokes and also have a childlike amount of excess physical energy. You can also likely think about people who you know who are never cracking jokes and are always very tired. Us humans are only able to have our incredibly powerful brains by being able to keep up with a very nutrient and energy-rich diet. If there is a chronic shortage of energy, the processes that are most important for survival continue, while many higher order brain functions like memory, concentration, ability to learn new things, thinking humorously and creatively, and play are downregulated like they are in depression. This is in part an adaptive response, because you can't be wasting energy in brain tissue thinking of funny connections while your other organs don't have enough energy to keep you alive. Play stops because it isn't safe. My second illustration is with dreams and nightmares. Imagine you're having a nightmare and it's so scary you wake up in a panic sweating. Many people might fairly assume that their dream was so scary they're sweating as if it all originates from the brain. However, as powerful as the brain may be, if anything, I think that is nearly the opposite way that it should be looked at. The way I see it, something stressful is taking place inside your body. While you're sleeping, your body periodically releases stress hormones, cortisol and adrenaline, which can induce sweating. Your brain, largely cut off from the outer world during sleep, is more obviously affected by the state of your inner physiology. You can imagine the brain trying to make sense of the large spike in stress hormones. Well, there must be a terrible beast chasing after me, it might think. Whatever your dream may turn into, it's largely a reflection of your inner physiology at that present moment. For example, cortisol is typically released just before waking, which is why the dreams people remember turn stressful just before the dream ends and they wake up. It isn't that the mind came up with a stressful dream and the body follows suit by releasing stress hormones and then sweating. It's that the body is releasing stress hormones, and sometimes it's to wake you up, and then your brain is trying to make sense of that. The mind is within the body. I've had dreams where I'm drowning at the bottom of a pool, and I wake up and it turns out I'm lying on my back and I couldn't breathe. It wasn't that I was holding my breath in my sleep because I thought I was at the bottom of a pool. It's that I was in a position where I stopped breathing, my throat relaxed and I stopped breathing, and then my mind was thinking, why aren't we breathing? And it thought, maybe we're at the bottom of a pool. And so it dreamt that I was at the bottom of a pool. People having a sleep paralysis dream often report dreaming of a demon-type figure sitting on their chest because their mind needs an explanation for why they are so stressed, can't move, and can't breathe. This is not to say that dreams are only physical, but that if you pay attention, you will notice that your dreams always fit into the context of your physiology. So this is happening when you're dreaming, but your mental state is not only a reflection of your physiology while you sleep. Your nervous system is constantly monitoring your body in a continuous effort to maintain homeostasis. If things are going wrong with your inner physiology, your nervous system and your brain will get signals that things are wrong. If it's receiving a steady stream of these signals that things are bad, things are bad, things are bad, this kind of bubbles up into your more conscious mind, and your outlook on life changes to one where you believe things are bad. You simply cannot see the world as balanced and peaceful though it may be, because inside you is chaos. This speaks more closely to the matter of how our inner world and our physical health can so powerfully change our mental health and how we see the world. As within, so without is a saying with many applicable meanings, and I believe it is particularly fitting in this sense as well. Often, peace must come from within. I believe a healthier individual can better appreciate how safe and prosperous our world is. If we have balance within, we may be in tune with the balance all around us. But unfortunately, many of us at many times have physical chaos and disorder inside of us, which makes us see the world around us as proportionately chaotic and disordered. Likewise, the more balance we have internally, the more chaos we can approach in our outer worlds. The more resilient we are, the more we can play with complex foreign ideas without fear that some novelty will hurt or infect us. The stronger we are, the more willing we will be to take on risks. If someone's physical health is in chaos, they may find it helpful to themselves to obsessively and compulsively arrange everything in their life to be overly neat and tidy because they're already dealing with more disorder than they can handle on the inside. This relates to the idea of setting your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. I also believe it is behind why people who are most sick and anxious tend to demand the most change from society and to criticize it the most too. I believe these concepts bring more nuance to the discussion on Dr. Randy Thornhill's parasite stress theory of values. I believe rather than using a left to right political spectrum, Dr. Thornhill's research would explain the world we live in even more if instead a spectrum of authoritarian to libertarian beliefs was used. On one end, you have authoritarianism, tribalism, centralized control, and fragile rigidity, and on the other end, you'd have liberty, individualism, and decentralized control and dynamic stability. I predict you would find people who are far right and people who are far left are more towards the authoritarian side of the spectrum and less healthy. And I also predict that you would find that people who are closer to the middle of the political aisle are more towards the liberty side of the spectrum and healthier. There's a fractal pattern here that emerges at both the individual and the societal level. Similar to how the innate intelligence of the body shunts energy away from digestion, creative, happy, or humorous thought, and from movement, so it can focus the available energy towards fighting the invading foreign infection, the emergent intelligence of a less healthy society may shunt more resources away from creative and constructive endeavors and more towards borders, centralized control, and defense, if it is under great threat of infection or harm. I have so much more I wish to explain about on this topic, but it'll have to wait for another time. For now, I see a very strong association with sickly, malnourished people, often on a poor plant-based diet, most often being the ones who are strongly convinced the world is a terrible place, or that other people and other ideas are bad and dangerous. These people tend to be on the far right and the far left of the political spectrum and are more authoritarian. I also observe an association with bruising easily, pale skin without much or any lively color to their complexion, high levels of anxiety, depression, violence, and self-harm, lack of drive and energy, being either pudgy or very skinny, and weak, unhealthy hair. It seems to me that a lack of cholesterol, iron, and other malnourishments are likely at play, while endocrine disrupting chemicals could be exacerbating problems.